we can hold the ideals of democracy. And when those ideals are extended to black and brown people, we are willing to erode the social safety net. Right? Welfare, for much of the New Deal, right, was in fact a project of Southern Dixiecrats aimed at addressing poor white Southerners. But the moment the face of the welfare state became black, as my colleague Martin Gillens writes, it became, right, an emblem of the problem with big government. What happens when we're willing to turn our backs on an idea, a robust idea of the public good, because it involves people who are not like us? It means that we're willing to throw democracy into the trash bin over the idea, over our commitment to the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, are valued more than others. It's the value gap is at the heart of our problem. The value gap is evidenced in our habits of living, habits that define where we live, where we work. I can't begin to tell you how often I have to leave the particularity of my experience at the door in order to make white people comfortable. It's almost as if, as James Baldwin writes in Notes of a Native Son, we have to make ourselves blank in order to wash away your guilt. And so we dance this dance, America's racial theater. It's this dance so that you can't be called a racist and I can't trigger your fears. Huh? The worst thing that you can be called is a racist, even though everything that's coming out of your mouth, Donald Trump suggests otherwise. Right? We find ourselves in this dance, unwilling to confront the ugliness of who we are. Just think about this. The last piece of great legislation passed in the Great Society was the 1968 Fair Housing Act. I'm watching my time. 12 years later, Ronald Reagan is elected. 12 years later, there is the triumph of a political ideology designed to undo the Great Society and the New Deal. Did we fix the country in 12 years? 1965, the Voting Rights Act, right? By 1980, wholesale attack. We don't need to protect them anymore, right? Shelby, we don't need to do it. And what happens after the Shelby decision recently, right? We get a proliferation of attacks on voter registration, voter IDs, right? Think about it. At every turn, at every moment of progress in this country, we have seen a reassertion of the value gap. At the moment in which we give voice to the principles of liberty and equality, right, in the context of the American Revolution, what do we get in response? We reconcile those principles with racial slavery. John Adams, it is said to King George, "We will not be your Negroes." At the very moment in which he's giving voice to an idea of freedom is predicated upon an intimate understanding of unfreedom, a reassertion of the value gap. In the moment of radical reconstruction, we offer, right, a vision of multiracial democracy. What do we get in response to radical reconstruction? We get convict leasing, right? Convict leasing. You wouldn't have the city of Birmingham without the labor, the forced labor of convicts, quote unquote. People arrested for what reason? Right? Slavery by another name, as Brother Blackman talked. And you get Jim Crow and a reassertion of the value gap. In the context, right, of the black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century, everyday ordinary people demanding dignity and standing. What do we get in response? We get the tax revolt in Northern California. And we get calls for law and order. Value gap. What do we get when we elect our first black president and we think we turned the corner? We get the vitriol of the Tea Party. And we get a wholesale attack, right, on the voting rights of black and brown peoples. At every turn, at every moment of progress, that progress is arrested by a reassertion of the value gap. We have to do the work, but we're afraid. We are afraid. White fear has driven this country since its founding. Think about Thomas Jefferson's notes of the state of Virginia. I'm going to come home. I'm trying to get there. Right? Think about, he said, "I tremble for this country because of the sin of slavery." Right? He was afraid of what that meant, the divine punishment that would come for holding another human being in slavery. And he writes that particular formulation in the section on habit formation. Because he said, what happens to a child who witnesses the violence of slavery? Something is broken on the inside of such a child who experiences that. Something happens to their character, Jefferson suggests. But in that moment of fear, right, it drives policy. Think about, right, the fear of Abraham Lincoln in the second inaugural, supposedly the second founding. Think about the fear surrounding Black rage with the Black Panther Party. You know, that cover of the New Yorker where they had Obama dressed as a Muslim and Michelle Obama as Angela Davis. And they were bumping fists, and people were like, what does that mean? Did they bumped fists? Did the Black people just begin revolution? Fear. Fear drives policy. The moral panics around the so-called super predators, where the data suggested was not true. What did the moral panics do? It drove mass incarceration. Think about what happened with the Central Park Five. Those babies were innocent. Their lives stolen. Think about all the millions of folk who are locked up because of fear. Fear driving policy. We can no longer be afraid. And that fear actually drives our political behavior, Black political behavior. As I said earlier, we're afraid to trigger your fears. So we will grit our teeth in the moment which you say something a little off color. Our fear of triggering white fear affects our behavior. So we're masking day in and day out, walking past each other, not really seeing the humanity of the person right in front of us. No wonder we're stuck. But Malcolm X said this, and I'm going to say this in front of you guys and make you mad. I don't care. We have to stop sweet talking. Tell you how we really feel. Tell you what kind of hell we've been catching, and let you know if you don't clean up your house. If you're not ready to clean up your house, you shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down. Now, I'm not trying to burn down anybody's house. But what Malcolm is talking about is frank speech. That we have to confront each other honestly. One of the most exhausting things I have to do is to convince my fellow white citizens of what is happening. Every time we have to engage in this haunting public ritual of grieving in public, we got to convince you that it happened.